Hi, my name is Michaela, and I'm here to talk about a topic that I really found interesting this semester, which is Indigenous women. I've always been really interested in the experience of women in a lot of the history courses I've taken, but a lot of those courses focused on women of European descent, whether it was women in Europe, women in New France, things like that. And I think I always kind of attributed one experience of women to all women, regardless of culture. I just kind of looked at them as like marginalized by men, subject to what men say and do, things like that. And something that I learned this semester is it is not like that with Indigenous women, and I think that's really cool and really fantastic. In the history of Indigenous people, one of the best examples, I think, of this point is when we learned about the Iroquois people. We learned that women in that society were powerful. Um, they had significant political and economic roles. They even took on roles as chiefs. We learned that in other Aboriginal societies, women played a significant role in choosing chiefs and things like that. But in Iroquois groups, women were chiefs, and that's pretty cool. They really were those leaders. And most Aboriginal societies were matriarchal, which is fundamentally different than European descendant societies, and modern Canada, which is based on a patriarchal view. So matriarchal being that the bloodline and family and everything is traced back through the women, through the mother, versus patriarchal, which is all through the man. And those two different functionings of society really, I think, demonstrate a difference in the treatment of women, and the power that is attributed to them and everything like that. So, yeah, definitely in these matriarchal societies, women had power. They were significant in determining families, everything like that. So they were respected and treated well. I think something that I thought about was what an impact then it was when those two tried to interact, both a patriarchal and a matriarchal society, and why that didn't really mesh so well. I mean, in a patriarchal society, women were marginalized and all of that, so it sucked, but it was what that culture and people had always known. But when European-based societies came along and created laws like the Indian Act, which said that a woman could lose her status through marriage. So a woman was totally dependent on who she was married to or who her father was, which, when you're just looking at it from a European or a settler view, is you see why that's wrong, but it's not that much different than maybe other laws against women. But when you look at it from an Indigenous view, that is fundamentally not the way that their culture functions. And so I really, definitely a different view on all of that. Something else that I really enjoyed learning about was the role of Indigenous women in the fur trade. We read the article, The Role of Native Women in the Fur Trade Society of Western Canada from 1670 to 1830, written by Sylvia Van Kirk. And she talked about Indigenous women being indispensable helpmates. They were critical, which I think is really cool. I think that from what I've learned about their role in the fur trade, a lot of those traders really wouldn't have survived without Indigenous women, and if those traders hadn't survived, the fur trade would not have been successful, and that really first great international economic venture in Canada would have failed. And so it's because of the role of Indigenous women that it even, I think, really could even get its foot off the ground. We learned about how they were crucial for marital alliances. They were the women in between, which means that they made it so that the traders and the indigenous groups could actually interact and trade and be civil and friendly to the level that they needed to be to engage in that economic relationship. Women fed them, clothed them. These poor men coming from Europe had no idea what they were getting themselves into with the weather or the conditions or the food, everything like that. So these women luckily were there to make food and clothes and snowshoes and things like that to teach them a lot about even surviving at all. Something I guess that is kind of a little bit upsetting when you know about the critical role of Indigenous women in the fur trade was kind of how that progressed. So when those marriages happened, they were done under the custom of the country. And I found it a little bit disheartening learning about how when Europe became more active in Canada and had a more political and economic role, all of that, and the church played a more prominent role, those custom of the country marriages were not recognized as being official. So they weren't legit, basically, which meant that European men didn't really have any legal binding commitment besides, I guess, their honor, which maybe wasn't all that important at the time. Obviously not important enough to outweigh them leaving and going back to Europe and remarrying to a white woman or marrying the women that were coming as settlers, which they weren't really there before, but as they began to come in greater number, men would leave. And that kind of made me really wonder about the impact that had on those families and women and children with the European men acting as fathers and everything, and then leaving. I wonder. Obviously, I think it was probably detrimental. I think luckily there's different kind of community system in terms of helping each other and raising children in Indigenous societies than European, luckily, or else I think it would have been a lot worse. But I wonder. I want to kind of learn a little bit more about that, I think. Something else that I felt was really cool to learn about was Indigenous women and their participation in activism. We looked at Oka and saw that women were not behind the scenes activists or anything. They were at the front lines in front of the men when they needed to be, and they were not quiet little please don't come or anything like that. Like, they were tough. And to see those women on those dirt bikes and things like that, like right in the action, whether or not you agree with what they were fighting for, it's pretty cool to see that and to see them not backing down from a challenge, I guess. And then also learning about movements like Idle No More and how that was started by 4 women, Indigenous and non, but how they saw a spot where the government was taking advantage kind of sneakily, and they said that's not okay. And they took even responsibility on themselves and Indigenous people to make themselves more aware, to not be idle, to be actively reading and understanding what the government is doing and how it could affect their rights, such as in that case, Indigenous rights to water. And that movement took off huge. I think it's still probably one of the most recognized movements by Indigenous and settler people today, like in terms of it still going on. And that was started by Indigenous women, and that's huge. And I think learning about all of this made it even more frustrating to learn about the modern treatment, I guess, of Indigenous women. And we talked a little bit about the call for an inquiry into the missing and martyred Indigenous women, and I never really realized before this semester how huge of a problem that is, and how many women it involves, and and how there's very little interest, I guess, from the government or significant people to actually take an interest and make a difference and stop that from happening. So that was definitely something I learned about that was frustrating. We learned about women like Pamela George and Helen Betty Osborne, Indigenous women who were murdered. One was a prostitute, one was a student. Regardless, they were targeted because they were Indigenous women, and the craziness of their cases and the trials and everything that took place, the reason that they were took so long, or the wrong people, like the people who were pretty obviously involved weren't necessarily accused or punished appropriately, was because it was Indigenous women who were murdered. So that burden of being Indigenous and a woman, the double burden right there, it's still, I think it's almost more prominent today than even in history, because pre-contact, I don't think that there was that double burden. It wasn't a burden to be a woman. It was power. It was respect. It was everything. And now that's a huge, huge shift for that culture. And yeah, it's crazy. And I think that the treatment of Indigenous women today is something that I think there really needs to be a lot of progress in, and a lot of work towards fixing that. And I hope that in my future learning and teaching and involvement in the world, that's something that I can learn more about and maybe take a stand for more, because I definitely have respect for the history of Indigenous women and where they come from, and that culture. So I think that respect needs to be reignited a little bit, and there should be inquiries and people should care, because it's important. And I think that's one of the things that I really got out of this semester was Indigenous women and kind of how great they are. Thanks for watching.